So I'm Nadira. It's nice to have you all here. Not only have I done a lot of work on millennials, but I am a millennial. I look like a millennial. I'm going to talk like a millennial. And we're going to do a little millennial chatting today. So here's the deal. I do a ton of this sort of work, and it gets boring for me, and I'm sure for you all sitting in these conversations it can get a little boring too. So every once in a while I like to do kind of the Bruckheimer approach and pull something from the headlines that we can analyze as a case study, and then from there get into what lessons we can pull from that and how we can actually learn to not just speak to millennials, which is sort of ostensibly the theme of our session, but actually to understand millennials so that when we are engaging them, we know where they're coming from and we can actually work with them well, which is its own challenge, as you all know. And this is obviously, we're a relatively small group, so if you are burning to say something, feel free to raise your hand. And I will try to leave a little room at the end for actual questions. So as I said, I like to pull from the headlines, and I basically, any basketball fans in here? NBA fans? All right, so some of you will know this story, but I basically got the best example of one of these ever recently. And I'll just set the stage so you all know what we're talking about, and then we can get into the nuts and bolts of what it teaches us about millennials. So once upon a time, like 3 weeks ago, in a land far away known as Los Angeles, there is a star center named Deandre Jordan. The basketball fans in here know who that is. And Deandre plays for the Clippers. He comes to them in like 2008, has one of these careers that slowly builds, and then this last season kind of has a breakout moment with two other superstars, Blake Griffin, his basketball BFF, and Chris Paul, who's sort of the star of his team. He has a coach who comes in, Doc Rivers, a couple years before, that really is an advocate for him and loves him. And by the end of the season, you end up in this moment where Deandre is he's a breakout star. He's about to become a free agent. At the beginning of July, he's in contract talks. He can actually look to build his career even bigger. So at the beginning of July, naturally, he and his agents go to talk to the team he's already with, the Clippers, because they're his family. As the story goes, first of all, it takes forever to even get this meeting scheduled. So he's wondering what's happening. Finally gets in the room with the front office folks at the Clippers, and they've got some things to tell him about how they're going to involve him more in promotions, and he'll be, more of a face of the team. But they've got nothing to say about the actual basketball. How is he going to contribute more? How is he going to get more touches and, sort of be the player that in his mind he thinks he can be? And as he's looking around the room, he also realizes none of the other players are actually even there. In fact, Chris Paul, who's the star of his team, is in the Caribbean somewhere with LeBron James and Carmelo Anthony riding a banana. Some of you may have seen this photo. And is not concerned at all with the fact that Deandre might defect. And he's in this moment where he's seeing suitors. So this is sort of percolating in his mind. Meanwhile, Mark Cuban, former businessman, now kind of professional character, is with owner of the Dallas Mavericks. And Mark decides he really wants this guy. So Deandre is originally from Houston. He's home in Houston. Mark flies to come to dinner with him. Mark sends Rick Carlisle, their coach, to go to dinner with him. Rick is like, this is how we're going to build this entire franchise around you. You are about to be the LeBron of Dallas. Dirk Nowitzki, this former star of, current, but soon to be former star of Dallas, we all think, he breaks his vacation plans to come back and go to dinner. This is basically the full court press in every form imaginable, to the point where Mark Cuban has Jerry Jones, who is the owner of the Dallas Cowboys, and Des Bryant, a star wide receiver, record a message telling Deandre that they would love for him to be in Dallas. So he is really feeling the love, and eventually, on the Friday before, during the free agency period, he decides to tell Mark Cuban, I'm coming. ESPN is blowing up. He signed a 4-year, or agreed to rather, verbally, which will become important in a second, a 4-year, $87 million contract. This is huge news. But you don't hear anything from him, actually. Mark Cuban is on his messaging app saying, this is amazing, it's gonna happen, people are excited, teams are starting to adjust, making different decisions as they court other players. There's silence from Deandre's house. The weekend goes by, and he's sort of, we know now, a little bit agonizing about it. And eventually, on the Monday, he picks up this phone, and he calls Blake Griffin, who's his soon-to-be former teammate and basketball BFF, and he's like, dude, I think I made a mistake. And that's like practically an exact quote, right? Blake is like, oh my God, you got to call Doc, who's their coach, right away, and I'm coming to see you. So Blake flies to Houston to go to dinner with Deandre. Deandre tells Mark Cuban, the Dallas owner, that he's on a date when in fact he's with Blake Griffin, plotting how he might actually stay in LA. Mark Cuban's getting concerned. He's like practically in the driveway trying to talk to Deandre. They never actually get to talk again, just so you know. And Doc Rivers gets the whole team together, the Clippers that are available, including Paul Pierce, who is a legend, in Boston and now had just signed with the Clippers himself, and flies to Houston to Deandre's house. And essentially what happens is they create, depending on your perspective, a human shield or a human fence to keep Deandre from changing his mind and deciding to sign a contract with Dallas. They're there for support in theory, but what they're actually doing is making sure that he doesn't flip-flop again and leave. And they physically stay there in that house with him until 12:01 when he can sign a contract to stay in Los Angeles with his old team. And then he does that, and he heads off to the Caribbean. He tweets an apology to Mark Cuban saying, "You're so understanding." Of course, hard to know how he knew Mark Cuban was understanding because I don't think they've spoken even up to now. In fact, I know they haven't. And when the Twitterati kind of takes him to task about his bad behavior, his mom responds to them about how well he was raised and the fact that he thinks. He's always been a thinker, and so that is why he's in the situation that he's in. And then you come to this week, it's his 27th birthday, 6'11", 200 and some odd pound man needing the help of his teammates to kind of, shore himself up, and he walks into the Staples Center in a suit, and he's a Clipper for life, as far as they're concerned, right? All's well that ends well, but kind of not really. Like if you're in recruiting, this is like an epic recruiting fail on every level. I mean, short of like Donald Trump trying to recruit Latino voters, I cannot think of a worse example of recruiting gone awry. And I think there are actually really great lessons for us in that story, because I don't think it's a matter of him being a kid with bad character. I think it's actually a lot of very millennial traits that some of you will recognize from your own recruiting experiences, and that we can actually, if we understand them, either anticipate and address ahead of time, or channel and work with to good effect. So what does Deandre's little fairy tale teach us about speaking to millennials? I think number one is that you have to talk mission. Right? Almost the most crucial thing in that story is the fact that when he first went to the Clippers, who are in his mind his family, they didn't really have anything to say to him about what it was that he was going to be doing there, right? Millennials are all about mission. They want to know that the organization that they're in is a good one, is one that they can be proud of, that when they go home and show their parents their business cards, there are really positive things to say, and that they're on a mission to not just do good for themselves, but to, as an organization, do good overall. But that doesn't just mean you have a mission statement. I mean, I don't know how many of you have read a mission statement lately. They're not the most specific documents around, and they're very buzzwordy. So you really actually have to be able to articulate on the ground right now what the mission of the organization is, and be able to communicate that to this young person. And by the way, not just say this is the mission at the high level, be able to say this is the mission and this is the way you can contribute to it. Now, you've heard millennials all want to be the boss and they want to do all the work, on the first day. And I don't actually think that's true. What they actually want to do is feel like they're not just a cog in a machine. They want to feel like they're able to affect the mission that they have signed on for and be a partner in it. Now, you might say, well, isn't that exactly what Mark Cuban did? Didn't he make it possible for Deandre to see that vision? And the reality is, it is as bad to oversell to a millennial as it is to not sell at all. The number one complaint I get from young people when they come to me talking about recruiting is that they were completely sold a line. And when you think about it, it makes sense. I remember chatting to the head of recruiting for Lockheed a couple years ago, and she was like, it totally is intuitive that these kids feel this way. We wine and dine them as we're recruiting them. We're showing them videos of all the things that they're going to be doing, that the company does. And it's no wonder that they get to the office on the first day and they think they're going to be working on Air Force One, which they're totally not, because that ain't the gig. But the problem is not that you shouldn't tell them what great things your company does. You should tell them, it's that you're not actually telling them how they fit into that story. So maybe you're not on Air Force One designing it, but you're copying schematics, or you're working on PR for that project, or you're doing something that fits into that mission that keeps you engaged in the mission long term. And that's kind of how we need to think of our millennials as we're recruiting them. They want to be partners. And any way that you can frame the work that they're going to do as a partnership is a positive thing that ultimately ends up wooing them. So it's really important to get that mission piece right, but understand that it's not just a question of the mission. It's actually a question of the mission and how we can contribute, and making sure that that contribution is not just defined, but sort of evolving all the time and constantly important, not just to you, but to the organization itself. So that's number one, which is talk mission. Number two is talk team. One of the sweetest moments from the coverage of the DJ fiasco, as it were, actually came out of Deandre himself talking about the team coming to his house. And he kind of famously had a little bit of tension with Chris Paul, the real star there, and to the point where petty things were happening, like, Chris would apparently high-five the other guys on the court and not Deandre, and he was like, going home, like, doesn't Chris love me? What's going on? And eventually, when this all goes down, Chris comes back from his vacation, apparently flies in, goes to Deandre's house, and is like, man, I don't know how you could think I didn't like you. We're brothers. And brothers was quoted everywhere because that meant something to him. And I think it's important to understand that that's how a lot of millennials think. It's a lonely world that we have grown up in. It's a very lonely world. And when you look at statistics that I'm sure we've all seen, the General Social Survey in 1985 asked people how many confidants they had. And the most common answer at that time was 3. Fast forward to 2004 and you ask people how many confidants they have, the most common answer is 0. And think about what that means for some of these young people. They literally don't have anybody to connect to and to talk to and to feel like they're sort of working with every day. It's a really sad thing. And it's exacerbated by this sort of hyper-connected world that we're in, because you're connecting, but you're not connecting substantively. And that can feel even worse, actually, because you've got a lot of friends, but you don't have any actual people who love you. It's true, right? We've all experienced that. So with this idea of team, it's important to sort of understand that millennials are coming to you without a lot of the structures that used to ground them socially. They're getting married later. And if they do get married, they're having children later. They're so mobile. They don't have those networks. And so in a way, work becomes their home away from home. They're looking for it to be sort of integral to their lives. And that means that their coworkers, the people that they're seeing every day, those relationships, that's family. And that's what they're looking for. So it's incredibly important that you talk about the teams, that you are not just sort of recruiters in the abstract or managers in the abstract, but you are advocates. You're people who give them honest feedback, not just either selling them a line or yelling at them when it's convenient, but actually giving them constructive feedback and criticism that they can work with, and that you're actually on a day-to-day basis engaging with them. That matters, it matters a lot. Now, it does not mean, however, that social media is the answer to all of this. A lot of times I talk to companies about connecting and sort of having a message, and they're like, well, we're on Twitter. That's it. Like, you can see everything that we're about there. That is about the external message, right? The fact of the matter is social media cannot create culture. It can't create connection. It can't create anything that isn't already there. And what you should actually be worrying about is where the there is. What is it internally that makes your organization amazing to work for? Who are the people there inside and how connected are they? And if that's right, then the social and everything else around it will actually work out and will be a no-brainer. But you've got to get the inside stuff correct. And by the way, millennials have been so marketed to over our lives that we are savvy to it when you are lying to us. So it is very dangerous to actually sell a millennial a line, because we'll just go home and Google it and then we'll tweet about you not telling the truth, and then you've actually talked about recruiting fail. It's not a good thing when that happens. So it's crucially important that you kind of communicate about culture in an authentic and meaningful way. And I think probably my favorite example of this comes from Ernst & Young, which is featured in my book. It's one of the companies that I write about, in particular because they're in an industry in accounting that nobody thinks of as cutting edge, right? Nobody thinks, wow, they get millennials. And what's funny is exactly for that reason, they've made it their mission to get millennials. And I remember sitting down with Jim Turley, who is our former chairman and CEO, who's a great advocate of all of this work, and talking to him about how he talks to his young people. And he was like, look, I go to all the offices. I go and sit with the young people in their engagements in a circle and talk to them about what they're doing day to day. I try to be that available. And then he sort of got a sparkle in his eye. And he was like, yeah, one of my teams in Australia, actually, the last time I visited, they told me they were going to be in a soccer tournament. And they finally decided if they won, they were going to send me a photo. So I'm on the plane, traveling. They win their tournament, and they send me a picture. He's like, I get back to my office, my assistant's like, you haven't responded to their email yet. Like, what are you gonna do? Thinking he's fallen off on the job, and he's like, I got it. And he's like, so one of the videographers comes in to shoot regular workplace videos that Jim would do on a normal basis. And he said at the end, I was like, actually do one more for me. He grabs a soccer ball off his bookshelf, because he's that cool. He has a soccer ball on his bookshelf in his office. And he heads it off camera, and he's like, g'day, congratulations. He makes a video congratulating the kids, so to speak. And this thing goes viral amongst Ernst & Young's 150,000 employees, because they are so excited that the CEO took the time to congratulate them. And just that special 3 minutes that belonged to them sort of resonated across the board and created an example also for talent throughout the organization, because it felt like these things matter. We are a family here. We do communicate in that way. And the reason I know it stuck is because I was in a bar in DC last year, late years after this had actually happened, and I just happened to be chatting to somebody next to me who was at Ernst & Young, and he brought up to me that their CEO had made this video because he was in Australia at that time, and he was like, isn't that cool? And I'm like, yes. Good to know when my research bears out true things in reality. So those are the kinds of connections you want to be looking for, and you want all the tools that you have to facilitate that connection, but you don't want to lean on those tools as crutches. So that's number 2. Really talk team. Number 3, talk learning. One of the most striking things for me about our Deandre case study is actually a comment Mark Cuban made after it all went down. And he sort of earnestly, insofar as it's possible for Cuban to be earnest, said, I think there were things that I assumed about him that I gave him credit for that didn't end up being true. And it's this sort of like hurt moment coming from him. But I think what it ended up sort of underlining or highlighting is the fact that there are a lot of things that older generations and managers take for granted in millennials that don't end up actually being true or endemic for us. And I'll tell you what I mean. I'll give you a quick example. The first time I sort of cognitively became aware of this was back in probably 2007 or so. There was a blog that the New York Times did called The Graduates, where they had editors of big college newspapers write a column for the paper. And there was a young woman from Dartmouth who wrote about her romantic comedy class at Dartmouth. And she said, we're watching When Harry Met Sally or whatever it is. And she's like, they have their meet cute. And then she said, I thought about it. And I thought about my own experience like that. And I realized I didn't have that. I didn't have a meet cute to point to in my own romantic life. She said, my first little grade school boyfriend was in 7th grade. We had been in school together our whole lives, but the first time we spoke was on Instant Messenger. When he asked me to be his girlfriend was on Instant Messenger. And the very first time we talked IRL, meaning in real life, we broke up. So there's this sense that you're able to constantly mediate all your communication. You're able to constantly manage all your relationships in this really control freakish way. And what ends up happening is that in real life, you don't have the ability to do those things the way older generations actually did. So I have people coming to me constantly saying, like, why don't these kids get it? What is the problem? This is like basic stuff. And the fact of the matter is, it is not basic stuff for our generation. When people ask me the biggest challenge, I think, for millennials, it's actually developing, for me, a sense of intuition. Right? There's so much now that we can Google and Yelp and figure out, or ask our parents, which we do. I mean, you would be amazed at the number of millennials whose parents still do their taxes. Like, that is a real thing that happens. Or manage, or go to interviews with them. That happens. Or call their managers and say, this person needs a promotion. That happens. Call their college professors and say, my kid deserves an A because I helped him with that paper. Your kid is 22. Like, really? But that happens. And so it's not a surprise that when that person then gets to the office or gets into the real world, or like, God forbid, tries to date somebody and marry them, they're completely confused. They don't know how to manage conflict. They don't know how to target real problems. So it's kind of like, as they're coming to you, from the very beginning of the process, from interviewing straight through the recruiting process, right down to when they finally are working for you, you really want to be asking them questions that get at that, helping them understand what it is that they are looking for and looking for the things in them that you actually need. So ask better questions in interviews. Don't just let things slide because they're on the resume. Recognize these days, a lot of times resumes don't match candidates' reality. I get constantly recruiters complaining to me that this person looks amazing on paper, and then when they're sitting in front of them and you're asking them about these things, they haven't actually done any of the learning. They haven't actually drawn any of the excitement and the joy and the real information out of these experiences that they're having. So you really have to probe and ask them good questions. What are they reading? That's always a good question. Have you seen any of their writing? Because a lot of times writing is the best way to see how well a person distills experience and allows them to frame it in a way that can be engaging and compelling. So those are all things that you want to actually be pushing for and looking for as you work with these young people, while recognizing that it's going to take work. Intuition is a very hard thing to develop, and we have had so much stacked against us in our efforts to develop it that it's not a surprise actually that we need work in that area. So that's number 3, which is talk learning. Number 4 is talk story. This is really hard for recruiters sometimes because the fact of the matter is young millennials do see work as an integrated part of their lives. So what they're looking for is how work fits into their overall story. Now recruiters hear that, or HR people hear it, and they're like, oh my God, I'm going to pull out the org chart and show you all the things you can do here. And you have to imagine how a millennial sees that. They're like, okay, that's a series of titles, like years served and salaries. I'm not like pledging SAE here. I want to actually know like what the opportunities and possibilities are for me at this organization. And we don't have good ways of talking about that. We don't have good ways of telling people what opportunities they should be aiming for, what skills they actually need to do the work. And a lot of times we're afraid to do that because we're saying to them, we don't want to guarantee you anything. But you have to recognize these kids are not looking for guarantees. They're just looking for possibility. They're looking for models. And to the point about models, one of the best things I think about the whole Deandre story is actually Paul Pierce being there. And those of you who know Paul Pierce as the Truth from his Boston days, is a legendary guy. There is no reason why he needs to show up to Deandre's house to barricade him in. But there was a moment in a story in SI this week, Sports Illustrated, where the reporter's talking to Deandre about him being in the house, and he was like, I looked over at Paul, and I thought about him coming into the league because the year that Deandre was drafted is actually the year Paul finally was able to win a championship in Boston. And that he had been working hard for 9 years not hitting that mark, and he finally hit it that year. And he said, I looked at Paul Pierce and I thought, if I leave and go to Dallas and these guys in LA win a championship next year or the year after or the year after that, I'm going to regret it because that's my story. And that would suck. And I think just understanding that that's what millennials are looking for. They're looking for that overarching sort of arc of life, and they're willing to do it with you. You all have heard that millennials won't work for you for 30 years. And I think that's a total actual misnomer. The reality is we don't want to stay in the same job for 30 years. And nobody really should want to stay in the same job for 30 years. But if you can create sort of a suite of options and opportunities, we would love to stay with the same brand, because how great a story is that? To be able to actually build a career and tell a story and architect a life under the banner of one organization that we are invested in and that we love. That is exactly what we want out of life, and it's something that you can give us. But the way to do it is actually to give us transparency and give us options. And if I can share my favorite example, it comes from Fahrenheit 212, which is an innovation consultancy here in Manhattan. And the guys that run it are all a bunch of bitter Gen Xers, which they would readily admit. And they're like, we have millennials come in, and they will literally, you can fire them, and they'll be like, oh, that's okay. I realize it wasn't really a fit. And they're like, if you fired me when I was 25, I would have killed myself. And the fact that you just kind of don't take it personally is amazing. And I say to them, like, flip that. What it is they recognize that this isn't working, but they're accountable to themselves. So they're glad. They're glad that they know now that it's not working and they can go get it right at the next place, right? They're willing to make mistakes in search of their best life. And if you think about that, if you understand the goal, the place that they're trying to go, all of this actually makes a lot more sense. And quiet as it's kept, everybody's leaving more now, right? The median job tenure for 20-somethings has kind of been stable over the last few decades. It's just that we talk about job hopping a lot more than we have traditionally. So in that model, these people are all ambassadors for you. You don't want people to come and have a terrible experience with you and then go out and tweet about it and Facebook about it. You want them to be able to come back. Like, I left Fortune formerly in 2010, and even now I talk about how amazing they were, and I'm a booster for them, and we have this amazing relationship that I think a decade ago people wouldn't have thought was possible, but to me seems to make complete sense. They're my family. I love them. Why wouldn't I ride for them whenever it's possible to do that? So in Fahrenheit's case, they actually have something they call 100-day plans, where they bring in they bring everybody on the team into the room, close the door, take away the cell phones, And every 100 days, they sit down and do this, and they actually work out the deliverables for each employee from the bottom all the way to the top. They decide on those together. And then they look at the deliverables from the last 100 days, and they each go through and say, well, how did we meet our goals individually? And everybody does that from the top to the bottom. And then they assign each other scores on how well they achieve those deliverables. And at the end of the year, that's attached to their actual compensation. So not only is there transparency in the work that these young people are doing, they understand where they're trying to go and what they're trying to achieve, but in the end, they have ownership. They have some ability to affect the real work of their firm every single day. And that is amazing. So that's number 4, talk story. Which kind of leads me to number 5, which is talk leadership. The funny thing about our entire sort of Deandre moment, I think, is actually that Deandre didn't want to be the guy, as far as I'm concerned. He wanted to be a guy. He wanted to be somebody who was successful, who was appreciated, who was loved. He wanted all sorts of love. But at the moment that Mark Cuban said to him, you're the guy, you're gonna be the face of this entire thing, I think the weight of that responsibility crushed him. And that's how he ended up on the phone crying to his homeboy, like, please rescue me. Because that's exactly what happened. And that's something that I think with millennials happens all the time at the highest levels, such as Deandre's, all the way down to the bottom. One of the absolute best stories I've ever heard came from an audience member to talk not unlike this, where he said he was managing a team of millennials. And they were supposed to be in a meeting, and he said he was running late, so he knew the extension for the conference room that they were supposed to be in. So he is in his office, and he calls them to tell them to start without him. The phone's ringing and ringing and ringing. You know those extensions, they just keep going. They don't ever bounce to voicemail. And so nobody's picking up. And so he's like, well, let me run down there. Maybe something's wrong. He gets downstairs, walks into the room, and all his millennials are sitting around the table watching the phone ring, because they're afraid to answer. Nobody wants to actually be the person to take the initiative, to lead by answering the telephone. And when you think about how much fear a person has to not want to be the one who answers the phone, that's amazing. I mean, it's amazing. But that's who you're dealing with. I think we have a real leadership crisis brewing. And it's, in fact, the premise of my entire book, right? Because I could see this happening. I can see it happening myself, where we don't necessarily have those skills, and we're not at organizations that are teaching us those skills. They're not developing us in a way that helps us feel like we do want to go out on a limb and make a decision. And those of you who are leaders, you know that's what leading is. You cannot poll your friends when you're leading, right? You cannot hope that everything's going to work out fine and only make the decision that's going to be loved and celebrated. You have to be willing to fail. And that is not something that has been cultivated in millennials. So when you think about how to help us lead, I often say don't think of millennials as Gen Y or millennials. Think of us as Gen WHY. If there's one piece of advice that I want you to walk away with, it is understanding that any problem with the millennial generation can be solved by telling us why. Giving us the rationale behind what you're asking us to do. Helping us to see what it is that we need to do from moment to moment in different situations that might happen in the workplace. Like Mitch Marks, who's an organizational psychologist that I love, he talks about an engineering firm where he said the young engineers just like never knew how to handle situations, and it was driving their boss crazy. And he said, finally, I just told him, just write up a form. In case of X, send an email. In case of Y, pick up the phone. In case of Z, like run to my office right away and close the door and tell me what's going on. And they handed that to the kids on the first day of work, problem solved, because they understood. They had structure, they had insight, and they were able to actually do the work in a way that made sense to them and actually made sense to their bosses as well. So that's number 5, which is talk leadership. And I think that's an ongoing sort of challenge for us. And if there's a call to action for you, it's really to start looking at these young people as leaders and start, God bless you, starting to develop them in that way and helping them to see themselves as leaders, forcing them to do things alone, forcing them to come talk to you, forcing them to articulate their thoughts in meaningful ways around work and around whatever else it is that they're doing in their lives, so that everything isn't just a tweet or a quick text. Really developing that long-term intuition. And if there's something to say at the end of the day, it's that if you do that authentically, that actually really works with this generation. The one thing that is sort of like a key to millennials' heart is just honesty. And we get so little of that in the workplace. I think a lot of times the things that I'm saying to you are not shocking. You know them because you're a human being. But somewhere along the line, we're taught to actually leave our human side at home and not bring that to work. So a lot of the best things that you can do when you're speaking to millennials is actually to bring the whole you to work, because that's what we're trying to bring to work, our whole us. I think that's me. So thank you guys so much.